Hi, this is Mike McGinnis from the Ostrom Workshop. I want to talk to you again about the topic of polycentric governance, which plays such an important role in the Bloomington School of Political Economy or Institutional Analysis. But in this particular video, I'm going to approach it from a little different perspective. I want to talk to you about the way groups or scholars in other research traditions or other policy areas study polycentric governance, but they study it under a different name. They study some version of polycentric, but it's not, they don't call it polycentric governance because they have their own reasons for calling it something else. And I've decided to call these aliases, popular aliases of polycentric governance. And I want to make some comparisons between how their terms are used in different literatures and the way polycentric governance is used in the Bloomington School, and basically make the argument that the polycentric governance concept as developed by Vincent Ostrom, Lynn Ostrom, and the rest of us around the Ostrom Workshop is a more powerful concept and really a more general concept that encompasses the others as special cases and sort of imperfect realizations. And I'm going to need to use a large number of slides to PowerPoint slides to demonstrate this point or to go through the things that I want to talk about. Let me set this up and we'll get started, okay? Okay, here we go. A PG by any other name. As I say, researchers have identified several modes of real-world governance that look like polycentric governance. But they're really not quite the same as what we tend to call as polycentric governance. And so my title, does a PG by any other name perform as well, sets this up to talk about these different aliases. Start with a quick definition of polycentric governance. Most of you have seen this before, hopefully. It's an effort that two of my colleagues and I put together in this edited volume on governing complexity that defines polycentric governance as something that has all of these structural, process, and outcome characteristics. And this is going to use sort of as the standard of comparison to look at the other sort of modes of governance as well. Here's the benefits of polycentric governance that are claimed in general, and we're going to talk about how well some of these are or are not satisfied in some of the other examples of a different type or related type of governance studied in different areas. Okay, and we'll go through this in some more detail later on, but I wanted to give you this quick sort of oversight here. Okay, here's the list of ones that I want to focus on: federalism, network governance, collaborative governance, adaptive governance, and so on. What I plan on doing in this video is going through each one of these, telling you a little bit about that research tradition or that policy concept, and then immediately talk about how well it ties into polycentric governance and what are some of the ways in which polycentric governance puts a different shake or a different light on shines a different light on those examples. And then at the conclusion, I want to sort of show how all these slight differences in which between polycentric governance and each of these examples kind of demonstrates that the polycentric governance really is the best name for this general type of governance, and that should become more widely known in the policy community, as it is, but I still think that it could be given some more prominence in the more mainstream policy literatures. Okay. The first type of governance we want to compare it to is federalism. It's very closely connected to the notion of U.S. federalism. Vincent Ostrom spent a lot of work early in his career connecting the concept of polycentric governance to the U.S. Constitution, the way it was set up to not have any one single authority in charge, but instead have a system of checks and balances and competing powers and overlapping authorities assigned to different branches of government and different levels of government. As is typically understood in the federalism literature in the United States, the focus is primarily on the relationship between the national government, sometimes called the federal government, and the state government. And there have been different names, different patterns of relationship between the states and the nation as a whole. If you take read a textbook from the topic of federalism, you'll see the various dual, cooperative, competitive, new federalisms, a couple sequences of new federalisms. And occasionally the local government usually tends to get short shrift in that, because the state-local relations, the states tend to have much more prominence over the local governments than the national government certainly does over the state governments. There's a concept here called marble cake federalism, which is very rarely used in the literature. It comes back from the 60s. There's a recent review of it here in 2000. But it's the closest fit to pure polycentric governance, because marble cake federalism is sort of an extension or a distortion or an elaboration on the basic notion of picket fence federalism, that each policy area would sort of have vertical pickets where the state, local, and national level authorities are operating in one area of public policy, say national security policy versus homeland security versus welfare policy versus health policy versus tax policy. Each of those sort of have different combinations, but neat levels between the local, the state, and the national level. Marble cake, they're all kind of mixed in together and on different sort of approaches. And that's really the kind of way that the polycentric governance tends to see it. And even students of federalism, traditional federalism, realize that the layer cake is, that's not the way the federal system, the US system actually works. There are examples of even national local relations with federal funded community centers, public health relations, or policies initially had a very strong local connection back in the early days of the Republic. There are interlocal compacts like metropolitan transit authorities, regional mass transit authorities, interstate compacts, the Colorado River Basin, state provincial compacts, the Great Lakes, which are not too far here from Indiana, are governed by a collaboration of American states and Canadian provinces, which is kind of an interesting sort of mixture. There are even examples of school districts, which tend to be very much at a local level. There are examples, for example, Vermont and New Hampshire, neighboring communities actually combine in school districts, which is kind of hard because the school districts are sort of usually the creatures of the states. So you get a lot of complexity involved in this. But the focus really within federalism is almost exclusively on the political. And that's really where they fall short of being what Vincent Ostrom and others have understood as polycentric, or in this particular work, the highly federalized system from Vincent, about overlapping jurisdictions, substantial degrees of democratic control within jurisdictions, and subject to an enforceable system of constitutional law. Okay, network governance is a more recent sort of concern, and it's usually applied at the local metropolitan level. Here, the focus is sort of the realization that public officials, especially at the local level, have to work very closely with local community leaders, especially in the private economic actors or major philanthropists at the local level, or nonprofit voluntary organizations that implement a lot of public services at the local level. And so you tend to see the notion of network governance is that all these different stakeholders, public and private, voluntary community stakeholders, getting together, primarily, at least in the political science and public administration literature, directed by or guided by or shaped by the public leaders. Now, in some cases, the delegation of authority, of different aspects of public authority to the private actors, can become so extensive that critics start to talk about hollowed out governance, that the public officials no longer are accepting responsibility for the conditions of the community as a whole, since they've delegated it to these private corporations or utilities that are being tasked and being paid and being rewarded to provide certain local goods or services. It's sort of a notion that this network governance really was driven by a concern that of government officials, government bureaucracies being much less efficient in their operation than private firms. And so there's an effort to get government agencies to work more like firms. But of course, there's some problems with that, in that public officials are supposed to not put profit above all else. They're supposed to put public service above all else. And from the point of view of polycentric governance, the network governance is really too simplistic, not only by focusing too much on the criteria of economic efficiency, but to realize that these stakeholders are not always being driven by the leadership at the local level. In many cases, in many communities, other private actors play a much bigger role in their community than mayors, especially in communities where the mayor is a relatively minor official in terms of not having a lot of authority, because the city council runs a large part of the local political apparatus is run not really by the mayor. It has sort of a minor coordinating sort of role. And commitment to public purpose within the sense of polycentric governance is something that needs to be shared more widely and not just limited to public officials. And I've found that the term distributed stewardship is a really good term to be used to understand what polycentric governance is all about. There's some leadership literature talks about distributed leadership, that corporations work better if you have a lot of leaders distributed at different parts and different levels in your companies. And that's exactly what we need, I think, in a democratic system of self-governing communities, is that there needs to be people looking out for sustaining the viability of the system as a whole at all levels of community action, state action, as well at the national level. Now, related term is cross-sector governance or collaborative governance, which again is very much focused on stakeholder governance, but is not so often focused on the local level, but can be involved at any level. You can have a lot of public-private partnerships get involved, state-owned firms of various kinds. Co-management or co-governance is an important aspect of some environmental policies in various parts of the world. National parks are often governed in some cooperation between public officials, forestry officials, private corporations, tourism groups, tourism corporations, voluntary organizations, environmental groups. So all these are sort of working together in some sense with some sort of collaborative arrangements. The idea is you bring all the major stakeholders together, get them to sort of talk through the problems and solve governance without going immediately to the courts or to sign some sort of contracts in a more official sort of basis. The difference in polycentric governance is that competition plays a major role in polycentric governance. And so it's not just collaboration. Even in the original 1961 article by Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, that competition can help generate self-organizing tendencies in metropolitan areas, as the metropolitans are forced to compete for residents through the mix of public services they offer. And there can be competition between the methods and the ideas used by the decision makers who are trying different ways to solve local problems. And that the authors back in the 60s even concluded that conditions fostering competition can emerge when these decision centers are located near one another and they have access to information about each other's performance. So this can sort of work very well. So increased collaboration in this sense about getting the conditions right for competitive markets, a collaboration can actually provide the foundation for competition. So the relationship between those different modes of policy interaction are more intimate than would be suggested by collaborative governments. This point about competition playing a major role is worth a little bit of emphasis. Here's a quote from an environmental scholar from 2011, saying that in polycentrism, when multiple actors at a variety of scales must compete in overlapping areas, they can often promote innovation as well as cooperation and citizen involvement. Now that's if everything works well, but there's at least that potentially positive benefit of competition. Just as in Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand sort of automatically generating some public goods and societal welfare from competition among self-interested, selfish buyers and sellers. But here it's a more focused much more not on something that happens automatically, but something that is dealt with or that is worked out in conscious conversation and deliberation among the actors. Now, speaking of Adam Smith and the notion of the invisible hand, is also a concept of adaptive governance in which complex adaptive systems, environmental systems, or even economic systems, certainly markets, can organize themselves. The actors within these systems can use the information efficiently in ways that generate positive outcomes for the group as a whole, in particular in the sense of providing enough redundancy and flexibility to respond to environmental shocks or other kinds of shocks to the system and maintain some resilience. And so there's a real emphasis by a lot of polycentric governance scholars on the bottom-up process, the emergence of this of order from these automatic interaction of people pursuing different sorts of interests. But I think that this emergence is not enough. That to have governance, to really have some guidance to society and some way of bringing some coherence to the types of policy outcomes that we see in a community of whatever size, requires somebody to be exerting stewardship and to be making tough trade-offs. It doesn't have to be the top political leader, although they are usually involved, but this notion of stewarding shared resources and managing shared resources in a way. And in polycentric governance systems, distributed stewardship works a lot better than delegating that responsibility to a specific set of public officials. So I've never quite bought the notion that emergent order is enough to really build effective governance in a political system as a whole. A multi-level governance is a popular term used in the European Union in particular. It's a bit of a misnomer because the focus really is on two types of governance organizations or public agencies rather than two levels. I mean, the initial problem in the EU is how you deal with the national governments and then the supranational government at the continental level among all the members of the European Union. But in the work here that being done by Hoge and Marx in particular is between two different types of organizations, that you have general purpose jurisdictions that are defined over geographic political units that the officials in that general purpose jurisdiction deal with a lot of different kinds of issues, versus specialized jurisdictions that are responsible for technical matters that often cut across general boundaries. We mentioned some of this earlier when we were talking about federalism, that we have a mix of this certainly in the United States, and it's often environmental resources like river basins or technical infrastructures, power infrastructures, or rural transit, mass transit sorts of systems often cross these jurisdictions of the general purpose units. So you have this sort of sense that you need a combination of both general and specific. Now, the general doesn't have to be based primarily on geography. It could instead be based primarily on family connections in some kind. And there's an argument that the Somali clan-based governance system can be seen as a different version of this. I find this a little limiting because there are many intermediate degrees of specialization between highly specialized and very general. The scope of authority is one of the major factors to differentiate among different kinds of approaches. And as I said, geography is not always the most important factor. A similar term that's also used primarily in the European Union is functional overlapping competing jurisdictions, which is an emphasis on cross-national units that govern highly technical issues for all EU members. And it draws very much on Thibault's original voting with defeat argument about competition among political agents and municipalities. Here, I think the issue is that this focuses too much on competition between technical entities and that are not really doing not really competing in a political sense, but are really working at different technical levels and getting into the kind of details that most citizens aren't directly engaged in anyway. And I think this approach also draws attention away from the individuals that are more critical maybe than the actual officials in these public agencies. And so it looks a little too much at the official responsibilities assigned in the legal systems and the constitutions of these countries and the treaty in the European Union, and not enough on the individuals that are really making the decisions here. At the international level, we get to a looser form of governance because there tends to be the national level is the level at which armies are organized and economies are organized and national identity is formed. But at the international level, there's also a considerable number of international regimes where governments and private actors cooperate in order to be able to run a globalized system. So you have maritime organizations governing shipping, you have airlines, telephone, telegraph, radio communications. So you have a lot of non-governmental groups, organizations also involved in this, environmental protection, climate policy, those kinds of issues. Initially in this literature, it was presumed that some one nation or small number of nations had to take leadership and serve as a hegemon over the regime as a whole and be willing to pay the costs of governance because they would benefit from the continued operation of the system as a whole. Generally, this is what the United States' role was seen to be after the end of World War II in establishing the foundation for the growth of the Western economy and the OECD countries and the institutions for trade and finance and transport and communication that dominate the world today. The international regimes have always sort of been problematic because they almost never have any sort of real coercive capacity. They rely on governments to live up to their treaty commitments, which is not always the best thing to do. And effective governance really requires some kind of coercive capacity to work very well. More recent elaboration on this regime idea is regime clusters and orchestration. That if you look at the trade regime and the environmental regime, you can't look at them separately. You need to see them as clustered together and interacting with each other in fundamental ways. Humanitarian assistance is another area in which a lot of different things need to be put together. Here, the term orchestration is kind of a follow-on from what used to be called a hegemon, but now it's more like someone conducting an orchestra, sort of keeping the different parts of the orchestra in tune and in sync and working together, and not really necessarily paying the costs of making sacrifices, but that playing that role. And in humanitarian aid, for example, is one area that I've done some work on. There's usually a lead agency, a Red Cross or a Doctors Without Borders or some group like that is taking the lead in a particular crisis situation. So this is an interesting manifestation or elaboration of the regime thing. And focus on issue clusters is really right on mark. But again, I don't think there's a need for a lead agency always, in that you could have polycentric systems. And in fact, many of the international regimes look much more like a bottom-up polycentric kind of system than anything related to a hegemonic system. Now, an issue cluster kind of idea at the local level, at the more specialized level, is becoming more frequently used. The term Nexus governance is being used quite a bit in terms of looking at the interaction of water policy, food policy, and energy policy, because water is involved in certainly in agriculture and in energy production in many parts of the world. And so that there's experts in one area can't really resolve the problem. You can't bring just the experts in one area together. You've got to start communicating across issue areas. So it's not just public, private, and voluntary actors getting together, but it's public, private, and voluntary actors coming with whole different scientific training, professionalizations, totally different experiences, and getting them to work together and to work out some way of common language, common way of working out and seeing a problem together. So it's another level, deeper level of collaboration, for example. And polycentric governance is ideally suited to this. So some of the people looking at Nexus governance are drawing explicitly on polycentric governance, and it's not necessarily a brand new idea. Vincent Oster, at least back in the early 70s, was already thinking about polycentric governance as being something broader than just politics, that the markets are polycentric. There's political competition certainly between political leaders. There's rule of competition in the legal community. There's competition in the scientific community. And all of these kind of need to be added in order to maintain a sustainable system of polycentric governance. And then finally, there are others to be determined or others to be discovered. I've listed here a few citations to a couple interesting areas that I haven't been able to follow up on as much as I would like. There is a literature on polycentric urban regions, focusing primarily on urban regions in Europe, where there's often multiple large cities clustered together, maybe from different countries. How does the spatial arrangement of those centers, urban centers, interact with rural communities, given the size of the Chinese economy and the Chinese population. This has become a very important part of public policy, local public policy in China, trying to understand how do you manage the growth of these clusters in order to, in their case, prevent too many people from moving into the cities and depopulating the rural areas, which they want to have a little more equity between the rural and urban areas, given their governing ideology. So this is an area that I haven't been able to examine as much as all, but I think it's a very interesting, would be an interesting approach to focus on the spatial correlation, the spatial configuration of services, in addition to the type of services are being involved or the scales of other kinds. Legal pluralism is an old term, especially looking at colonial areas where the colonial power would often come in and impose a level of governance on the colonized, and then how do you sort of reestablish the system? Berman is a classic work from the 80s talking about Western governance, processes of Western governance, and liberal democracies is really sort of a hodgepodge of different kinds of governance systems, even going back to the many conflicts between the Holy Roman Emperor and the leader, the Pope leading in the Catholic Church in Europe, and the kinds of conflicts between those. And more recently, some work on polyphonic federalism, which I think is a nice twist on polycentric, because here it would be different sounds or different voices being heard. And the way Shapiro uses it, it's primarily a legal sort of approach in terms of legal studies of looking beyond the perspective of the national government and the state government's perspective on controversial constitutional issues, but also bringing in the others. And I just left this thing here about fill in other aliases you run across in your own work through the wide, wild world of polycentric governance. So, get to the end. Does the PG by any other name perform as well? No, not really. Polycentric governance sets a high standard, and partial realizations are just that, partial. They don't get all of this. Here's a quick summary of the insights from what we've had. Polycentric, highly federalized, not just politics, not neatly nested. Commitment to public purpose needs to be widely distributed beyond public officials. Competition is critical. Emergence is not enough. Geographic and other distinctions vary in different policy areas. Non-official public entrepreneurs play critical roles. You need at least some coercive capacity. single lead agency may not be need to all. And if you're looking at some situation that crosses different policy domains, polycentric governance is really a good way to go. So in real world settings, no polycentric governance type system can fully satisfy all aspects of its ideal types. And so the performance of actual cases of polycentric governance and comparing different types, different modes, and different configurations of polycentric governance in different policy areas, in different regime contexts, is an open question for researchers. Stay tuned for further theoretical exploration and rigorous empirical research. And I encourage you all to join in and join the community of people who are trying to understand how these complex systems of governance can be made to work more effectively. Thank you very much for listening.